The air in the terminal was a stale cocktail of recycled oxygen, burnt coffee, and the faint, anxious sweat of 1,000 hurried travelers. It was a purgatory of delayed departures and final boarding calls, a place where time seemed to stretch and snap in unpredictable rhythms. Sunlight, thick and yellowed by the triple-paned glass, fell in heavy stripes across the worn industrial carpet. Outside, heat waves danced on the tarmac, distorting the shapes of baggage carts and fuel trucks into shimmering mirages. Ilara Vance sat in one of the bolted-down rows of unforgiving plastic chairs. She was a study in stillness amidst the chaos. A woman who had passed the peak of her youth but had not yet settled into the softness of middle age. Her hair, a nondescript brown with a few strands of determined gray at the temples, was pulled back in a simple, severe knot. She wore faded jeans, a plain charcoal t-shirt, and comfortable, broken-in boots that had seen more miles than most of the planes outside. She held a paperback book in her lap, its spine broken and its pages softened with use. Her eyes, however, were not on the text. They moved with a slow, deliberate economy, tracing the flow of human traffic. She noted the nervous twitch of a young man checking his watch for the 10th time in as many minutes. She registered the practiced ease of a flight crew striding through the crowd, their rolling bags clicking in unison. She saw the exhaustion etched on the face of a mother juggling a crying toddler and a precarious stack of luggage. Her senses absorbed it all, cataloging, assessing, and dismissing without a flicker of expression. Her posture was a subtle tell, the only clue to a life lived with a different set of rules. She sat perfectly straight, not rigid, but aligned. It was the posture of someone who had spent countless hours holding a position, waiting. Her shoulders were relaxed, her hands rested lightly on her knees, but there was a coiled potential in her stillness, like a spring compressed just shy of its limit. She occupied her space with an unnerving lack of waste. No fidgeting, no casual shifting of weight. Just a quiet, centered presence that made her almost invisible. A cacophony of sound erupted from down the concourse, shattering the dull roar of the terminal. Laughter, loud and forced. The sound of male bravado. 3 men, all in their late 20s or early 30s, swaggered toward the gate. They wore matching olive green flight jackets, adorned with an array of colorful, intricate patches. They were marine aviators, and they moved with the ingrained certainty that the world was their personal runway. The one in the lead was the source of the noise. He was handsome in a sharp, angular way, with a jaw that seemed permanently clenched and eyes that darted around as if looking for a challenge. A patch on his chest read, Cap D. Riley, and below it, in aggressive red script, was the call sign, Viper. He walked with a proprietary air, his 2 companions orbiting him like smaller, less brilliant moons. They were his wingmen, his audience, his chorus. Viper's gaze swept the gate area with casual disdain. He saw the tired families, the stressed business travelers, the huddled students. He saw background characters in the movie of his life. His eyes passed over Ilara without a flicker of recognition. She was part of the scenery. A drab splash of gray against the terminal's beige canvas. He and his friends commandeered a block of seats near the desk, their laughter and loud talk carving out a bubble of obnoxious territory around them. Ilara's focus did not linger on them. They were a known quantity. Young men drunk on adrenaline and institutional pride. Predictable. She returned her attention to the wider room, her gaze sweeping the exits, the security cameras, the location of the fire extinguishers. It was an old habit, a mental mapping that was as involuntary as breathing. A quiet voice in the back of her mind, a voice honed in places far less forgiving than this, was always running its diagnostics. The gate agent, a young woman named Sarah with a nervous smile and an ill-fitting uniform, made the first boarding announcement. Her voice was thin, almost lost in the terminal's din. We would now like to invite our active-duty military members, families traveling with small children, and anyone needing extra assistance to begin boarding. A few people shuffled forward. Ilara remained seated. The pre-boarding call was not for her. A few minutes later, Sarah's voice returned, a little stronger this time. We are now pleased to invite our first-class passengers to board through the priority lane. Ilara closed her book, the soft sigh of the page settling against its neighbor the only sound she made. She stood up with a single, fluid motion and walked toward the designated lane. Her carry-on was a small, dense-looking duffel bag made of black ballistic nylon, and it didn't swing or sway as she moved. It was a part of her, an extension of her centered gravity. She was the third person in line. An elderly couple stood ahead of her, fumbling with their tickets. Behind her, she heard the scrape of boots and the jingle of metal zippers. Captain Riley and his entourage had arrived. "Well, look at this," Viper's voice boomed, pitched for the benefit of his friends and anyone else within earshot. "Looks like we got a real traffic jam in the fast lane." His wingman snickered on cue. Elara did not turn. She kept her eyes on the back of the elderly man in front of her, giving him the space and time to get his documents in order. The air behind her grew thick with impatience and arrogance. "Excuse me," Viper said. The words were polite. The tone was not. It was the sound of a command disguised as a request. "I think you might be a little lost, ma'am." She felt his presence directly behind her, a wave of cologne and self-importance. She still did not turn. She could hear the smirk in his voice. "The line for general boarding hasn't started yet," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "That'll be in a few minutes." Back there, he gestured vaguely toward the crowded seating area. The elderly couple finally moved forward, and Elara took a single step to the podium. She placed her boarding pass on the scanner. The machine chirped its synthetic approval. She turned then, not to face him fully, but with a slight angle of her body, a subtle, non-confrontational shift. Her eyes met his. They were calm, clear, and unreadable. "My ticket is valid," she said. Her voice was low and even, carrying no hint of anger or defensiveness. It was a simple statement of fact. Viper was taken aback for a split second. He had expected confusion, or maybe an apology. He had not expected this quiet, unshakable certainty. His embarrassment flared instantly into aggression. It was a reflex. "Right," he scoffed, recovering quickly. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her worn boots and simple clothes. "Must have won the lottery, huh? Or maybe you're somebody's guest." He leaned in conspiratorially toward his friends. "Probably got lost on her way back from the galley." The wingman dutifully erupted in laughter. The gate agent, Sarah, looked on, her face a mask of anxiety. She wanted to intervene, but the three men in their flight jackets, radiating military authority, were intimidating. Elara simply picked up her boarding pass. She offered them an out, a final chance to de-escalate. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Have a safe flight, Captain," she said. The use of his rank, spoken in that flat, unimpressed tone, was like a spark on dry tinder. It wasn't deference, it was dismissal. It told him that she saw him, understood his performance, and was moving on. His ego couldn't allow it. As she turned to walk down the jet bridge, he spoke again, his voice sharp and loud. "Hey, you know, there's a dress code in first class. Or there ought to be." She did not stop. She did not look back. Each step was measured, deliberate. The sound of their continued laughter followed her down the ramp, but it was just noise. Irrelevant data. She had dealt with louder noises and far more significant threats than the fragile pride of a young pilot. Her seat was 2B, an aisle seat in the second row. The cabin was hushed, the air cool and clean. She stowed her duffel in the overhead compartment with an efficient lift that spoke of a strength that belied her frame. She settled into the wide leather seat and buckled the belt, the click of the mechanism sharp and final. She did not take her book out. She simply sat, her hands resting in her lap, and watched the rest of the passengers board. A few minutes later, the trio of pilots entered the cabin. As fate would have it, their seats were directly across the aisle from her. Viper took the window seat, one wingman next to him, the other in the row behind. He saw her and a triumphant smirk spread across his face. He had a captive audience. "Would you look at that," he said to his friend, loud enough for Elara to hear clearly. "Guess they'll let anyone up here these days. Probably lowers the property value." Elara's gaze was fixed on the bulkhead in front of her. She adjusted her seatbelt, pulling the strap snug against her hips. Her breathing remained slow and even. She was a stone in a river, letting the current of his insults wash over her without effect. A young flight attendant, barely out of her teens, came by offering pre-departure beverages. She approached the pilots first. Viper gave her a dazzling, predatory smile. "I'll have a whiskey, darling. Top shelf. Start a tab for me." "Sir, we can't serve alcohol until we're airborne," the flight attendant said, her voice trembling slightly. Viper's smile tightened. "I think you can make an exception for one of America's finest, don't you? We're the ones keeping you safe up here." The flight attendant looked flustered, trapped between regulations and the pilot's intimidating presence. She glanced around for help, her eyes landing on Ilara. Ilara met her gaze. She gave a slow, deliberate blink. It was a tiny signal, almost nothing. But it conveyed a universe of meaning. "I see you. Stay calm. Follow your training." The flight attendant took a small, steadying breath. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice a little firmer. "Regulations are regulations. I can get you a water or orange juice for now." Viper's face darkened. He shot a venomous glare across the aisle at Ilara, as if blaming her for the flight attendant's newfound resolve. He settled for a glass of water, snatching it from the tray with petulant anger. For the rest of the boarding process, he and his friends kept up a running commentary of loud jokes and critiques, all subtly or overtly aimed at Ilara. They talked about welfare tickets, flying incognito, and the declining standards of air travel. Through it all, Ilara sat in perfect, composed silence. She was a fortress, and their words were nothing but wind against the stone. She was waiting for the plane to take off. For the drone of the engines to provide a blanket of white noise. For the forward motion that was a temporary escape. The plane pushed back from the gate, taxied to the runway, and after a brief hold, the engine spooled up to a deafening roar. The force of the acceleration pressed Ilara back into her seat. For the first time since boarding, a flicker of something changed in her expression. A subtle easing of the tension in her jaw. She was in the air. In transit. A place that was neither here nor there. For a person with her history, it was the closest she ever came to feeling at peace. The flight leveled out at 35,000 feet, a silver dart sailing through a sea of brilliant blue. The cabin settled into a comfortable routine. The flight attendants began their service, the cart rattling gently down the aisle. Viper and his friends had gotten their whiskeys and were now on their second round, their voices growing louder, their laughter more frequent. Ilara had declined a drink, accepting only a bottle of water. She had twisted the cap off and set it in the holder beside her. She wasn't reading. She was observing the cabin, her senses attuned to the rhythm of the flight. The gentle hum of the engines, the creak of the fuselage, the airflow from the vent above her head. She was listening to the aircraft. An hour into the flight, it happened. It began not with a bang, but with a shudder. A violent, unnatural vibration that ran through the deck plates, up through the soles of her feet. It was not turbulence. Turbulence was a wave, this was a seizure. It was mechanical. Wrong. A collective gasp went through the cabin. Drinks sloshed. A few people yelped in alarm. Viper and his friends stopped laughing, their faces suddenly pale. Then came the sound. A low, grinding groan from somewhere deep within the plane's right side, followed by a sharp, percussive thump. The aircraft lurched violently to the right. The overhead bins rattled, and a few popped open, spilling their contents into the aisle. Red lights flickered on the cabin ceiling, and the seatbelt sign chimed with frantic urgency. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but it was strained, tight with a terror he was trying desperately to conceal. "Folks. We seem to be experiencing some engine trouble. Flight attendants, please take your seats immediately." The gentle hum of the right engine was gone, replaced by a terrifying silence. The plane began to bank, a slow, sickening tilt as the remaining engine struggled to compensate. Panic began to bubble in the cabin. A woman started to cry softly. A man was praying in a low murmur. Viper was frozen in his seat, his knuckles white where he gripped the armrests. His bravado had evaporated, leaving behind the raw, naked fear of a man who understood just enough about aerodynamics to be truly horrified. He knew what a single-engine failure on a twin-engine jet meant. It was manageable, but it was a serious, full-blown emergency. But it was worse than that. Another jolt, harder this time. The lights in the cabin flickered, died for a second, then came back on at half their previous brightness. The emergency lighting strips on the floor glowed with an eerie green light. A new alarm began to sound from the cockpit, a high-pitched, insistent shriek that cut through the cabin. This was not just an engine failure. It was a cascade. In the midst of the rising panic, Ilara Vance moved. There was no hesitation. No moment of fear. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside her, a dormant system coming online. Her body language transformed. The quiet, unassuming passenger vanished, replaced by something else entirely. Her back straightened, her shoulders squared. Her eyes, which had been passive and observant, were now sharp, analytical, focused with an intensity that was almost frightening. She unbuckled her seatbelt with a single, precise flick of her wrist. The click was impossibly loud in the tense cabin. She stood up. The senior flight attendant, a woman named Maria with 20 years of experience, was making her way down the aisle, her face grim but professional, trying to calm the passengers. "Please, everyone, stay in your seats. Everything is under control." Ilara intercepted her. She did not grab her arm or raise her voice. She simply placed herself in Maria's path. What was the second alarm? Ilara's voice was calm, clinical. It cut through the noise of the panic. Maria stared at her, bewildered. "Ma'am, you need to sit down." That was not an engine-out warning, Ilara stated, her eyes locked on the flight attendants. That was a hydraulics alarm. "You have a catastrophic fluid loss." "Am I wrong?" Maria's professional mask crumbled. Fear and shock registered in her eyes. "How? How could you know that?" "Get me into the cockpit," Ilara said. It was not a request. The pilot flying this plane is incapacitated or dead. The co-pilot is overwhelmed and out of his depth. You have approximately 10 minutes before you lose all primary flight controls. Every word was delivered with absolute, chilling certainty. Viper and his friends, seated just feet away, heard every word. They stared at her, their mouths agape. This was the woman they had mocked. The drab, invisible passenger. "I can't do that," Maria stammered. "It's against every regulation." Ilara took a half step closer. She lowered her voice, but it lost none of its authority. "Your regulations were written for a world that no longer exists on this airplane. Right now, there is only one rule: survival. The men in that cockpit are about to fly 200 people into the ground. I am your only other option. Make the call." There was something in her eyes, a depth of experience and a complete absence of doubt, that broke through Maria's training and her fear. She saw something she had never seen before. She made a decision. She nodded, her face ashen. "What do you need?" "The access code. Now." Maria spoke the code in a choked whisper. Ilara was already moving toward the cockpit door, her step steady and sure despite the plane's lurching and bucking. She keyed in the code. The lock clicked open. She pushed the door and stepped inside, closing it firmly behind her. The scene in the cockpit was one of controlled chaos. The captain was slumped over the yoke, unconscious, a trickle of blood coming from his nose. The co-pilot, a young man named Ben who looked barely old enough to drive, was frantically trying to manage a constellation of red and amber warning lights. His face was slick with sweat, his hands shaking on the controls. He was shouting into his headset, his voice cracking with panic. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Flight 724. We have an uncontained engine failure, catastrophic hydraulic failure. Losing altitude." Ilara placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a firm, steadying pressure. Ben flinched violently, crying out in surprise. "Who the hell are you?" he yelled, his eyes wide with terror. "I'm the person who is going to keep us alive," Ilara said, her voice a pool of calm in the storm of alarms. "My name is Ilara. What's yours?" "Ben." "Okay, Ben. You're doing a good job, but you're overloaded. I need you to focus. Fly the plane. Just fly the plane. I'll handle the systems. What's your altitude?" 22,000. Dropping fast. Airspeed. 280 knots and decreasing. Okay, Ilara's eyes scanned the entire instrument panel, absorbing the data with inhuman speed. She saw the cascade of failures. The right engine was gone, its fire suppression system discharged. The primary hydraulic systems were all reading zero pressure. The backup electrical generator was offline. It was a nightmare scenario. Ben, she said, her voice sharp but even. Listen to me. We're going to declare an emergency descent to 10,000 feet. We are going to divert to the nearest suitable airport. What's the closest field with a runway over 8,000 feet? Her questions were precise, cutting through his panic, giving him tasks, a checklist. It was the only language a pilot understood in a crisis. He fumbled with his navigation screen. Travis Air Force Base. About 70 miles east. Perfect, Elara said. An Air Force base will have the best emergency response. Notify ATC. Tell them we are declaring an emergency and diverting to Travis. Tell them we will have limited to no flight controls on final approach. While Ben talked to air traffic control, his voice now steadier, Elara's hands moved over the overhead panel. She was rerouting power, bypassing fried circuits, trying to coax life back into dead systems. She moved with a familiarity that was staggering. It wasn't the knowledge of a private pilot or a flight enthusiast. This was a deep, intrinsic understanding of complex aerospace engineering, the kind learned in laboratories and simulators, not from a passenger manual. On the ground, at the Oakland Air Route Traffic Control Center, a veteran controller named Frank was handling the emergency. He listened to the co-pilot's frantic calls, his own heart pounding. But then, he heard another voice in the background. A woman's voice. Calm, clear, issuing technical commands. Flight 724, Frank said into his headset, confirm who is on the flight deck. Ben, prompted by a look from Elara, responded. Center, I have a passenger assisting me. Is that passenger a certified pilot? Elara leaned toward the microphone. Negative, Center. But I am qualified, her voice was flat, professional. Request you patch us through to the Travis Tower and have them activate the Dragon protocol. Tell them. Tell them callsign Spectre is on board and assuming command of the aircraft. There was a stunned silence from the ground. Frank, a retired Air Force Master Sergeant, felt a cold chill run down his spine. Spectre, it wasn't a pilot's callsign. It was a ghost, a legend whispered about in classified debriefings. A name associated with a unit that didn't officially exist. Dragon Protocol was a designation for an extreme national security event, a crippled aircraft carrying a high-value asset. Frank keyed his mic, his voice trembling slightly. Flight 724. Message understood. The Dragon is awake. Godspeed, he turned to his supervisor, his face pale. Get me the Pentagon on a secure line. Right now. Back on the plane, Elara had managed to restore partial power to one of the hydraulic pumps using the emergency ram air turbine. It gave them sluggish, almost useless control, but it was better than nothing. Okay, Ben, she said. We're going to fly this thing like a brick. No fine movements. We use the rudder and differential thrust from the good engine to steer. We're going to land fast and we're going to land hard. You just keep us pointed at the runway. I'll handle everything else. For the next 20 minutes, she became a part of the machine. She talked Ben through every step, her calm voice a lifeline in the screaming chaos of the dying aircraft. She cross-referenced checklists from memory, manually deploying landing gear, calculating their glide path on a piece of paper when the flight computer failed. In the cabin, the passengers could only listen to the groaning of the airframe and pray. Captain Riley sat in his seat, utterly humbled. He was a pilot. He knew the sounds. He knew the impossible odds. And he knew that the quiet woman he had belittled was now in the cockpit, engaged in a battle with physics and failing machinery that he wouldn't have had the first clue how to fight. He wasn't a warrior. He was just a passenger. She was the one in the arena. Travis Tower, this is Flight 724, Ben said, his voice now almost steady. We are 10 miles out. We have the field in sight. Elara looked out the cockpit window. The long, wide runway of the Air Force Base was laid out before them like a promise. A fleet of fire trucks and emergency vehicles, their lights flashing, were already lining the tarmac. You're doing great, Ben, Elara said, her voice soft. Just like the simulator. Bring her home. The landing was brutal. The plane came in too fast, the crippled hydraulics making any kind of flare impossible. They hit the runway with a bone-jarring impact that sent a collective shriek through the cabin. The landing gear on the right side, weakened by the initial explosion, collapsed. The plane slewed sideways, the wingtip scraping against the concrete in a shower of sparks. Ilara was fighting the controls alongside Ben, her hands a blur, wrestling the massive, dying machine into a straight line. The plane skidded for what felt like an eternity, groaning and tearing itself apart, before finally shuddering to a violent, lurching stop just yards from the end of the runway. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and the distant wail of approaching sirens. They were down. They were alive. Ben was slumped in his seat, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. Ilara reached over and killed the power to the remaining engine. She ran through the emergency shutdown checklist from memory, her movements still precise, still economical. Her job was not done. The cabin doors were thrown open by the emergency crews. The evacuation slides deployed. The flight attendants, led by Maria, began shouting commands, their training taking over, getting the terrified passengers out of the crippled aircraft. Ilara opened the cockpit door. She looked at the chaos of the evacuation and then at Ben. "You did good," she said quietly. She turned and walked out into the cabin, moving against the tide of fleeing passengers. She went to her seat, retrieved her small black duffel bag from the overhead, and calmly walked to the emergency exit. She slid down the slide with practiced ease and landed on the tarmac, rolling to her feet in a single, fluid motion. She walked away from the wreck, toward the flashing lights, her face betraying no emotion. She was just a passenger again. An entourage of official vehicles was speeding across the tarmac. Black sedans and military police trucks. They weren't heading for the plane, they were heading for her. A car screeched to a halt in front of her. The back door flew open and a man in a general's uniform, stars glittering on his shoulders, stepped out. He was older, with a face like a roadmap of old campaigns. He stared at Ilara, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Vance," the general barked, his voice a mixture of shock and awe. "What in the hell are you doing on a commercial airliner?" Ilara just looked at him, her expression unchanging. "Trying to get to San Diego, sir." The general shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. He turned to the bewildered FBI agents and base security personnel who were now surrounding them. "Stand down, all of you," he commanded, his voice booming across the tarmac. "The situation is secure." He gestured toward Ilara. "This is retired Chief Warrant Officer 5 Ilara Vance. And if she says the situation is secure, you can take that to the bank. She had this bird landed before your jets were even scrambled." The name, the rank, hung in the air. Chief Warrant Officer 5. The rarest, most senior rank for a technical expert in the military. A quiet professional, the agents looked at her, then at her simple clothes and unassuming demeanor, and then back at the four-star general who was looking at her with something approaching reverence. The passengers were being herded onto buses. Captain Riley and his two friends stood off to one side, wrapped in emergency blankets, their faces pale with shock. He watched as the general spoke to Ilara, his posture deferential. He saw the FBI agent stepping back, giving her space. He saw the truth. He had mocked a force of nature. He had tried to humiliate a legend. The scale of his foolishness, of his arrogance, crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. He felt small, insignificant, a boy in a costume playing at being a warrior, while the real thing had just walked past him in jeans and a t-shirt. Later, in a makeshift debriefing room in the base command center, the full story came out. The flight crew, the passengers, they all told the same story. The arrogant pilots, the quiet woman, the crisis, the impossible calm. The general sat across a table from Ilara. The FBI, the NTSB, they all waited outside. "They want to give you a medal," he said. Ilara shook her head. "No, sir. Medals are for people who go above and beyond. I just did my job. It's what I was trained to do." "And what about Captain Riley and his friends?" the general asked, his eyes hard. "Their commander is on his way here. Their careers are over if you say the word. Conduct unbecoming an officer, public endangerment, dereliction of duty by creating a hostile environment for a crew member. The list is long." Ilara considered this for a moment. She looked out the window at the broken airplane sitting on the runway, foam still clinging to its wings. They're young, she said finally. They're arrogant. They confuse confidence with competence. Today, they learned the difference. They saw what happens when things actually go wrong. They saw fear, and they saw a solution. That lesson is more valuable than any punishment you can hand down. Let them fly again. They'll be better pilots for it. And better men. Her judgment was not an act of forgiveness. It was a tactical assessment. A training opportunity. It was colder and more final than any court-martial. The general nodded slowly, understanding. You haven't changed a bit, Vance. No, sir, she agreed. I haven't. She stood up. Is there a car that can take me to San Diego? He walked with her out of the building. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was cool and smelled of jet fuel and cut grass. As they walked toward a waiting black sedan, they passed the holding area where the flight crew was waiting. Ben, the young co-pilot, saw her. He snapped to attention, his face filled with awe and gratitude. He rendered a sharp, perfect salute. Maria, the senior flight attendant, simply put her hand over her heart and nodded, tears in her eyes. Ilara acknowledged them with a small, brief nod of her own. A quiet recognition between professionals who had shared a crucible and survived. From across the tarmac, Captain Riley watched her get into the car. He didn't see the woman from the gate anymore. He saw the calm in the storm, the voice of reason in the cockpit, the quiet authority that had commanded generals and saved 200 lives. He saw strength. True strength. And he knew, with a certainty that would haunt him for the rest of his life, that he had been in the presence of greatness, and he had been too blind and too arrogant to see it. The car pulled away, disappearing into the twilight. The general stood watching it go, a faint smile on his lips. He turned to a young Air Force captain standing beside him. You see that, Captain, he said quietly. That's the difference between wearing the uniform and being the mission. The young officer just stared after the car, speechless. He had just seen a ghost, and he would never forget it.